The idea of monster submarines is almost as old as the practical ocean-going submarine itself. The first such serious proposal outside of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea appears to have popped up in Russia amidst the pre-World War I naval arms races. This proposal was for a 4,700-ton vessel that would be capable of 26 knots on the surface and use a combination of torpedoes, mines, armour plate, and 4.7-inch guns. This would be a vessel that was on a par displacement-wise with a number of recently commissioned light armoured cruisers, and substantially more powerful than some of the older cruisers that were still considered front-line, if somewhat small, combatants. However, the capabilities of the Russian designers and the capabilities of the Russian shipyards are two very different things, and although Imperial and later Soviet Russia would continue to have an on-again, off-again interest in the type, nothing ever came to fruition, at least in the period the channel covers. The first practical cruiser-type submarines, for a given definition of the word, would be developed during World War I by the British and the Germans. The latter actually built their first big submarines as merchant vessels in an attempt to evade the British surface blockade. But with the entry of the USA into the war against them, any argument for submersible freighters for the high seas fleet went out the window, and the surviving hulls were converted to U-Kreuzer or U-Kreuzer. Armed with a pair of 150mm guns for surface action, a pair of 88mm guns which could be used against either air or surface threats, as well as a couple of torpedo tubes up front with no less than 8 reloads apiece, the U-Cruisers represented a serious long-range threat to merchant shipping before the advent of the escorted convoy, and even once those were brought in, technically the subs actually outgunned a large number of escorts assigned to various convoys, although of course as submarines they were far more vulnerable to damage. One downside to these U-Cruisers though was their origin as freighters. They'd been built more for slow-speed endurance than high-speed combat operations, and so a number of changes had to be made to their drive systems, linking the diesel and electrical systems together to increase power output, and fitting new propellers, amongst other things. Due to these issues, a series of new designs purpose-built for war were drawn up, including two that would have armour plating to address the biggest weakness of a submarine in a surface gun duel. Simply put, a surface warship can take quite a few hits, as long as those don't hit anything vital like magazines or machinery, and the ship will still remain afloat. But a submarine's greatest asset is of course its ability to travel underwater, and therefore any hit that punctures the pressure hull, even if the shell goes into crew quarters or food storage, takes that capability away. These German designs can be viewed in two groups. Project 46 and Project 46A were unarmoured craft. Project 46 was somewhat rushed to get a submarine of this size of any kind in service quickly. Though delays were encountered during construction, some of the largest foreseen issues were simply avoided. One of the main issues with the U-freighter conversions was, as mentioned previously, speed. Calculations showed that a diesel engine of around 3,000 brake horsepower would be needed, but no one in Germany could build a diesel at that stage that would both fit inside a submarine and be capable of fast running that had a power output much over about 1,700 brake horsepower. Steam turbines were also ruled out for the moment, and so the Germans just accepted, well, this first iteration is going to be a little slower than ideal. Just stick the most powerful, reliable engines you can get in there and call it a day. Some armour was placed over the control room, enough to stop a destroyer shell at longer ranges, and with a surface displacement of just under 2,000 tons, the U-139 class was born, capable of a top speed on the surface of about 15 knots, with a gun armament the same as the converted U-freighters, but the torpedo tubes jumped to 6, with 4 in the bow and 2 at the stern, with 3 full sets of reloads carried for a total of 24 torpedoes. Due to the anticipated long duration of missions, water distillers were fitted in addition to the more conventional freshwater storage. 3 of these submarines would be built and commissioned, with U-140 and U-141 having slightly more powerful engines than U-139. A further 9 craft to Project 46A specifications were then ordered. These would be a little bit heavier, but the main difference was the proposed installation of a 3,000 brake horsepower pair of diesels, 3,000 horsepower each, as it was promised that these would be ready in time for these later vessels, and this would boost surface speed to around 18 knots. There would also be 12 additional torpedoes, which would be stored in pressure-tight containers outside the pressure hull and therefore could only be reloaded while the sub was on the surface. Only one submarine of this type was ever completed, the class lead U-142, and she was commissioned the day before the November armistice, so she never saw action. The other group was Projects 47 and 50. These would be the armoured submarines. The first of these was a much larger craft, coming in at around 3,800 tons on the surface. For propulsion, it would have 3 propeller shafts and 4 diesel engines. The outer 2 shafts would be used when the sub was on the surface, each one connected to a 3,000 brake horsepower diesel, and when running underwater they were connected to a 500 horsepower electric motor each. The central shaft was connected to a 2,000 horsepower electric motor, with the intention to run this off the current generated by a pair of 1,750 horsepower diesels, the other 2 diesels in question, which would primarily be used as generators. These diesels would also be responsible for charging the batteries when the sub was surfaced. This would allow a top surface speed of 18 knots, despite the increase in size and weight compared to Project 46A. The main driver for the increase in displacement and size came from upgrades to the weapons and, of course, the protection. The main battery was doubled to 4 150mm guns. The pair of 88mm anti-aircraft guns was retained, as were the 4 bow and 2 stern tubes, but 2 more tubes were also added, one pointing to either side, mounted just behind the conning tower. And with all the space taken up by the new tubes and the additional magazine space for shells, overall torpedo count actually dropped to 16. In theory, this would allow for 1 in each tube plus a reload for each tube, but in reality, the side-firing tubes would probably have been single shot, with the extra torpedoes put for the front tubes instead. Initial ideas for this class were actually to have 2 conning towers and all the guns mounted in between them, but this was dropped in favour of just the 1 conning tower, with pairs of heavy guns back-to-back, fore and aft. 2.4 inches of armour plating was spread along the exposed portion of the hull when the sub was at the surface, and there was also a 1-inch armour deck. However, this kind of submarine would be about twice the cost of a Project 46 or 46A type, and didn't offer all that much difference in terms of range or time on station. And with the approximate cost of said submarine being also similar to outfitting 4 merchant steamers as disguised raiders, it was felt best to hold off on ordering these, at least until the general effectiveness of the Project 46 submarines could be ascertained as compared to converted merchantmen. While this pause was in place, one last design would be drawn up. Project 50 was longer but slimmer, and so ended up displacing about the same as Project 47. This submarine reduced armament back to 6 torpedo tubes, the 4 in the bow and the 2 at the stern. It also deleted the 88mm guns in favour of retaining the 4 single 150mm weapons, and it was supposed to use a steam turbine setup, which it was thought would allow it to reach no less than 25 knots on the surface, with the boilers placed external to the pressure hull in their own tanks, which were in turn mounted into recessed fairings. These tanks would then be flooded when the submarine dived to cool the boilers quickly, which would then deal with the latent heat that would otherwise build up inside the submarines. Several submarines of this type were ordered in February 1918, but none were ever laid down before the war ended. Much of the information about these submarines' designs, plus of course some of the earlier cruiser-type submarines themselves, would fall into Allied hands at the end of World War I, where they were much examined, in particular by the primary subject of today's video, the British. The Royal Navy, of course, had been developing its own large submarines during the war, the infamous K-class, which we've covered in a separate video, and the related derivative M-class, the ones that originally came with a 12-inch gun attached. They blended this experience with information derived from the Germans to come up with an entirely new kind of submarine. Whereas the K-class had aimed to keep up with the fleet and take out enemy battleships with torpedoes, and the M-class had aimed to sink enemy craft with single heavy shells, this new submarine would be aimed not at enemy fleets, but instead at long-range commerce warfare, with a capability to deal with any annoying convoy escorts along the way. It's a common misconception in some quarters that this new design was essentially a reskinned German U-Kreuzer. Post-World War I comparisons actually left the British with the impression that although German submarine technology was undoubtedly ahead of them in some areas, it was equally behind British practice in a number of others. The greater success of the U-boats compared to the Royal Navy's craft had largely been a function of the number of targets that each side had available to them, more than any particular better or worse performing submarines. But, having seen the arms races and one-upmanship that accompany the Dreadnought arms race, and was looking honestly to kick off again between the UK, US and Japan, it was also decided that the new submarine would have to be built in conditions of extreme secrecy, because if no one else knew what you were building, they couldn't build a response to it. And so it was perhaps somewhat appropriate that she would end up being named X1. This all started in 1919 with the commerce raiding concept outlined previously. There were three main areas in which the designers wanted the new submarine to break ground. In order of priority, these were, firstly, speed. The steam-powered K-class had speed, but they had a laundry list of issues to go with it. The diesel-powered J-class were far more reliable, but had fallen short of their speed target, and in any case they only carried 18-inch torpedoes, whereas all the latest submarines were sporting 21-inch weapons. It was hoped that new technology would allow for high speed and a reliable diesel-powered power plant. In second place was underwater agility. While the K-class seemed to have a favourite activity that involved turning into giant lawn darts, somewhat improbably, the M-class, despite the massive 12-inch gun, had proven to be fast-diving, easy to handle, and relatively agile. Although she was supposed to be able to fight destroyers, sloops, and armed merchantmen, the appearance of aircraft or a full-size cruiser would require the new submarine to dive quickly, and in the case of many smaller escorts, potentially evade a lot of depth charges. Thus, by drawing more on the M-class than the K-class, but also incorporating a series of quick-blow tanks that had been installed in the last of the K-class, K-26, as a safety measure, it was hoped that, although large, X1 would be among the best-handling submarines on or under the high seas. And in third place, believe it or not, for a cruiser submarine, was firepower. One constant feature of all large submarines was a debate on surface firepower. Since a submarine would never be able to carry as many guns as a ship of similar displacement, it was important that the gun be absolutely optimal. If it was too small, the submarine might be outranged and unable to rapidly put down its target. If it was too large, then the rate of fire would probably be too slow to score a hit before it was too late, especially since any submarine was likely to be far more lively on the surface than the average similar-sized surface warship, and would be at a significant disadvantage when it came to spotting due to not having, a big mast to stick a rangefinder on. Somehow, a fast-firing but also hard-hitting gun would need to be found, as would a solution to the long delay between a submarine surfacing and the guns becoming operational, as the gun crew had to get out of the conning tower, run along to the gun, retrieve any ammunition, and then crank the deck gun around to aim at the enemy. There was also a background aim. The development of aircraft might be rendering surface warships more and more vulnerable. Although in the USA at the time, Billy Mitchell was preaching as gospel what would turn out to be the single least effective method of attacking ships at sea from the air, over in the UK, a large force of torpedo bombers already existed, and the ink was barely dry on aborted plans to hit the High Seas Fleet with over 120 of the aircraft in a mass raid that would have taken place if either Sopwith had been able to build the bombers faster, or World War I had lasted into early 1919. Thus, a few admirals also saw X1 as a possible stepping stone to a fully submersible battle fleet. After all, an aircraft couldn't bomb or torpedo what they couldn't find. They couldn't find what they couldn't see. So, given all those priorities, they turned first to the power plant. Given that this was the post-World War I period going into the 1920s, there was a paradox that would become all too common during the 20th and 21st century Royal Navy, where innovation was demanded, but the government demanded that all of this should be done for 6 shillings, 2 pence and halfpenny. Some of the measures made sense. After all, why invent a new torpedo tube or a new ballast tank when you had a bunch of pre-existing designs on the shelf and ready to go and you could just reuse them? But other choices made somewhat less sense. In the power plant's case, the most powerful, reliable British-built diesel was a 1200 brake horsepower unit, of which 3 had been installed in the J-class. Given that, depending on whose estimates you believed, a craft the size of X1 would need between 5 and 8,000 brake horsepower to reach 22 knots, you can immediately see the problem. At least 4 whole engines would have to be accommodated, or possibly more, depending on if you linked the electric motors and diesels together for surface running in the German style. Given that German U-boat diesels of similar power output to the British were a little bit smaller, somebody suggested just taking 4 of those out of war prizes, but this was discarded as an option due to a lack of familiarity with the fine details of German engine design, the rather obvious lack of spares, and the fact that any engines so taken would have an unknown amount of wear and tear already present. Instead, it was decided to adopt a form of a measure that had actually been taken with the earlier J-class. Back then, Vickers diesels were found to yield about 100 brake horsepower per cylinder, so when they needed to get more power, Vickers had just added cylinders to an existing engine design, and that had worked to a degree. But no one was mad enough to suggest expanding a 12-cylinder engine to a 30-cylinder engine to meet X1's power requirements. And so instead, they actually reverted to the original 8-cylinder model, which had a nominal 800 brake horsepower, and instead of adding cylinders, they scaled the engine up to achieve, at least on paper, around 3,000 brake horsepower per engine, of which there would be 2. Coupling these to the 1,000 brake horsepower electric motors would have given a theoretical 8,000 brake horsepower, thus allowing for a 22-knot surface speed, even by the most conservative of estimates. Unfortunately, it turned out to not quite be that simple. The Vickers 8-cylinder 800 brake horsepower unit was a straight 8 design, and in this time period, such a layout was known to vibrate quite a bit. On a smaller unit, this wasn't actually too bad and could be compensated for, but on a scaled-up unit, the issue would be exponentially worse. To try and mitigate this, the engine bed was built to a scale and weight more usually associated with battleship armour plating, and this was effective in essentially confining the engines so rigidly as to prevent them from turning the aft engine into the sub into a giant underwater massage chair. But it also meant that every single bit of out-of-kilter energy that created those vibrations in the first place was confined to the engine itself, which made them interesting to be around at full power, to say the least, complete with oil fountaining up on a scale not seen since the last of the great vertical triple expansion engines had been installed in the Navy's pre-dreadnoughts. This, rather predictably, led over the course of the submarine's career to a number of engine failures, which was somewhat mitigated later by downrating the engines to around 2,250 brake horsepower from a nominal 3,000, which allowed the poor engine room crew to not have to deal with the high power regimen that caused the worst of the breakdown issues. But between this and the engines slightly underperforming even when they were pushed to the maximum, it meant that against a top speed planned of 22 knots, she would only ever make around 19.5 knots, and if you didn't want to find your chief engineer muttering quietly to himself curled into a ball in the corner, or else coming after you with an especially large wrench, it was found better to stick to between 16 and 17 knots, which in and of itself was not that bad for a submarine of this size, but it was a far cry from the envisaged plans of being able to run down an entire scattering convoy. Ultimately, the marine diesel was not even 2 decades old as a technology and was subject to rapid advancements. Ironically enough, within the submarine's lifetime, reliable engines on the power scale needed were indeed developed, but no refit was undertaken for various reasons that we'll see later. A plan to mitigate potential issues in the main engines had actually already been put into play as a backup during the design process. 2 additional 1200 brake horsepower diesels to be used as generators were also installed. This would allow for separate charging of the batteries, or, as per the German practice which had inspired the idea, they could be linked to the electric motors, pushing each in combination with the batteries up to 2000 brake horsepower, which would thus give a notional 10,000 brake horsepower in conjunction with the main diesels. So even if the main drives, which were still under construction, fell short of the power output that was necessary for 22 knots, that power would still be there in combination. But as you might have guessed from what we've just discussed about the sub's actual top speed, this measure also didn't work out. Although it was sound in principle, and in all likelihood actually probably would have been workable if they'd used a couple of J-class engines for the purpose, for space and cost-saving reasons, a pair of nominally 1200 brake horsepower units were taken from the ex-German U-126 after she completed evaluation trials. Unfortunately here, the Royal Navy was damned by its own previous success. U-126 was a large mine layer that had been constructed toward the end of World War I, and significant corners had been cut in the construction of her engines to try and conserve various scarce metals, a scarcity that had been caused by the Royal Navy's blockade of Germany. Thus, although initially fine when installed, after half a decade of usage, the engines were degrading rapidly, and they would go on to struggle to produce even 2/3 of their designed power output during their second life aboard X1, and that's when they decided they were going to work at all. Their lack of power output meant that the power generated by them couldn't actually keep up with the battery drain that was the other half of the equation for their use, and so while they would be useful in low-speed surface running and in charging the batteries, the use of the main electric motors to supplement the main diesels to achieve the 22-knot high speed, even if the 3000 brake horsepower engines weren't working properly, was discontinued relatively quickly. Luckily, of all the propulsion units, the 1000 brake horsepower electric motors proved to be the one part of the propulsion system that actually worked as advertised, giving the giant submarine a relatively useful submerged speed of 9 knots, and proving to be the vessel's salvation on more than one occasion when one or more of the diesels broke down, but X1 would manage to limp home purely under electric power. Likewise, the batteries took to being scaled up far better than the diesels did, and they were practically pampered with their own dedicated cooling systems, a CO2 fire suppression system, and a completely separate ventilation system to deal with the potential buildup of explosive and poisonous gases. With all that said, you might expect X1 to have been a complete failure. But in fact, although she wasn't quite as swift atop the waves as desired, she was still able to compete with most other submarines in that area, and in the 2 other major areas of advancement, she would actually do incredibly well. The second listed priority had been handling. This was greatly helped by a decision that allowed for significant refinement of her hull form. Most ships' designs, and indeed most submarines at this stage in world history, were tested with relatively simple hull form models placed in water tanks, which they were then either towed through or moored in and the water was run past them, a principle that was established about half a century earlier by the saint of hydrodynamic engineering, William Froude. It was reliable and it was cost effective, at least for ship designs. However, in this case, it was decided to build a much larger than normal model, almost 19 feet long, which was both large enough to have its own motor installed along with remote control equipment, and naturally allowed for far more detailed hull modelling to be done. This self-propelled model could then be used for a range of tests in a submerged condition that were difficult or almost impossible to do with a static towed unit. One area, though, that these tests initially missed was the hydroplanes. The submarine had two small retractable units up front, one on each side, and two massive non-retractable hydroplanes right behind the propellers. The diving and depth-keeping characteristics were excellent in both tank testing and in the actual submarine's early service, so all seemed to be well. Until further trials at sea revealed that almost all the work in this regard was being done by the aft units, trying to dive, just rise in the water column, or even control your depth using the forward units alone, just in case something happened to the aft ones, proved almost impossible. They were barely able to control the sub in any way, shape or form. This would lead to a rather hasty refit with a second similar pair of hydroplanes installed up front, and thus it's possible to easily date photos of X1 that were taken early in her service career by simply looking at the bow. If you see only one set of hydroplanes, then it's an early photo, whereas most of them will have a kind of biplane design to the bow. Of course, hydroplanes are only a third of the diving equation, the other two-thirds being the ballast tanks and the pressure hull, the latter dictating how far down you can go and come back up again. Smaller submarines had reasonably impressive dive depths for the time, but the larger ones had issues. The K-class, for example, famously had a maximum dive depth that was actually less than their total length, which meant in the event of a all-too-familiar lawn dart scenario, you might end up with a bow dangerously close to pressure failure, even if the tip of the stern was still sticking up out of the water. Although the M-class were far better able to control their dive angle and depth, their own maximum dive depth wasn't all that great. X1 was even larger than a K-class, and with her gun turrets potentially faced additional problems due to the fact that they pierced the pressure hull. But the designers were determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past, and she was built solidly enough to be able to dive down to between 450 and 500 feet, depending on if you wanted to go down to test depth or flirt with possible crush depth. Not only was this around 100 foot further down than her own length, which was useful, it was the deepest any submarine of the 1920s was actually capable of going, which potentially offered a degree of immunity from depth charges as long as word of her performance didn't get out, as of course these would be set to detonate at a far more normal 200 to 300 foot dive depth, which was about as far as most submarines of the period could go. As mentioned earlier, the ballast tank arrangement was quite complex. A number of rapid blow and flood tanks were installed at either end, both as an emergency measure and to allow very quick, fine adjustments of trim. These tanks were each capable of dealing with a ton of water, either in or out, roughly every 5 seconds. Additional pumps were installed to allow a large amount of water to be evacuated from the submarine itself, which of course was where water was not supposed to be at any time. For example, the magazines had their own pumps, which were designed to stay ahead of incoming water flow should somebody forget to seal the gun turrets before diving, or should they take any hits in action. This would prevent the submarine from being lost by these large compartments flooding, and would actually allow the sub to dive even with this damage in place. This was all in addition to regular ballast tanks, and indeed so extensive was this equipment and so capable that during one set of trials something ruptured in one of the main ballast tanks, something that would be extremely dangerous at best in most submarines and absolutely would require immediate work. But on X1, the tests were able to proceed with the tank completely out of commission, its loss more than compensated for by all the other tanks, and the repairs were done once the trials had ended. It also turned out that the quick-blow tanks could be used on their own to address trim in all but the wildest of situations, which meant that the main tanks could be trimmed very precisely and then just left in that state for long periods, which reduced workload. In fact, it turned out that the submarine was actually, of all things, a little overly buoyant, which would have boded well for future upgrades had she or successor subs remained in service during the 1930s and possibly into World War II, as she had to have some additional ballast installed, which of course could have been removed to offer more displacement for said upgrades. The only downside to the whole handling system was the internal telephone units which were used to control it, as it turned out that having to use a man to repeat out loud the captain's orders to the relevant nearby station from the nearest telephone unit was actually slower than the captain just grabbing a loudhailer and yelling down the length of the sub if the hatches were open. Under normal circumstances, it turned out that X1 could go from being fully surfaced to having the main hull awash in just over half a minute, with just under another 2 minutes needed to reach periscope depth. Although thanks to the superb degree of control presented by the combination of tanks and hydroplanes, a crash dive was also trialled, in which all the bow tanks were flooded as fast as possible, with the hydroplanes set on full down angle and the engines pushed to maximum speed. And in this trial, she was able to vanish completely from sight, starting from fully on the surface, in less than 60 seconds. That left the armament, of which, of course, the most innovative part was her main battery of guns. As covered earlier, the balance of size versus rate of fire for a cruiser submarine's guns was an incredibly difficult one, and indeed it was soon concluded that none of the existing and frankly bewildering array of medium-caliber guns in the Royal Navy's inventory was suitable. And so a brand new gun was developed, the 5.2-inch 42 caliber quick-firing Mark I. 6-inch, 5.5-inch, 4.7-inch, 4.5-inch, and 4-inch had been considered, but rejected, either on the grounds of being too light to meet the stated objectives, which were to sink an enemy destroyer-sized targets fairly rapidly at 6,000 yards range, or else too heavy to be rapidly fired from what was still a relatively small platform. Another issue was that at these smaller gun calibers, unlike the much larger battleship guns, there are actually certain advantages to sliding breech block mechanisms over the hinged interrupted screw type, and most of the existing Royal Navy inventory in the medium caliber range used the interrupted screws, whereas the 5.2-inch would be a rare sliding breech block type. These guns could elevate to a maximum of 40 degrees and were relatively quick to traverse and elevate. A brief consideration was made to making them dual-purpose and thus in theory capable of engaging aircraft, but this was quickly dismissed on two grounds. Firstly, the extra elevation would require the mountings to be heavier, larger and more complex, and would also need additional anti-aircraft fire control systems installed. And it was also held, rather sensibly, that the submarine's best defence against aircraft was simply to get out of the way and dive, rather than try and sit on the surface and fight it out. Some 2-pounder 40mm guns were also carried, but only as sub-caliber practice guns to save wear on the main gun barrels, and they consisted of a cut-down 2-pounder barrel that slid into the 5.2-inch gun breech for use in exercises. 4 of the 5.2-inch guns would be carried in a pair of twin turrets or twin mounts, depending on what you want to call them, one fore and one aft. These were fully powered and allowed for a rate of fire of about 1 round every 10 seconds per gun, which was about a mid-range rate of fire in cruiser-grade guns of that period, but not bad for a relatively cramped submarine-mounted weapon. The turret itself was open at the back and was not watertight, which precluded the use of ready-use ammunition storage, and the front face was essentially only weather and splinter resistant, with the main restriction on the whole setup's efficiency simply being how much power could be diverted to its systems, a situation which would improve as the submarine settled on the surface and thus less power was needed for the ballast tank pumps and the hydroplanes. The submarine was also equipped, unusually, with a fully functional, if compact, rangefinder and fire control system mounted along with the periscopes, with each turret also having its own rangefinders to act as backups in case communication with the main fire control system was lost. The director control tower, where the primary fire control computer was located, was mounted atop the conning tower, and the rangefinder, which was as large as those found in a number of World War I era dreadnoughts, was placed atop a specially modified periscope, with the plan of attack being for this periscope to be used to determine range to a target, bearing, and other information that was needed while the submarine was still submerged. The fire control computer would then calculate the needed elevation and bearing for the guns, and as long as the submarine remained submerged and undetected, continuous observation could be used to check and recheck the fire control solution. The turret crews would be positioned on ladders right below the turrets in the trunk or barbette, and at the moment the submarine broke the surface, the power operation of the turrets would allow them to be swung about to point in the right direction. Since the gun crews had simply to climb a short ladder instead of scramble up the conning tower, out, down it, along the deck, and then up to the guns, as was the practice in normal submarines, the gun crews would be in position even as the submarine was levelling out. The guns would be elevated to the appropriate angle as indicated by the fire control computer, and gunfire could be commenced within a matter of seconds of the submarine emerging from the depths, with X1 turning out to be a relatively stable gun platform, and with a thoroughly checked fire control solution at short range, it was not inconceivable that a ship caught in its sights might still be in the process of just noticing that a submarine was even there in the first place by the time the first shells came crashing home. Although she was not listed as armoured, the thickness of the plating around the trunk of the turrets formed a basic barbette, and likewise the type and thickness of steel in the pressure hull did provide for a form of protection. It wasn't much in either case, but it was enough to resist blast, splinters, small arms fire, and, at least in the case of the extremely curved pressure hull, potentially reject a 3 or 4 inch shell or similar at medium to long ranges. So satisfied was the Royal Navy with the general performance of X1's gunnery that some officers were already thinking ahead to a hopeful X2, which they saw, instead of as an iterative improvement, perhaps armed with an additional twin turret, or some even suggested a pair of triple turrets. A few in this group had even thought that such a craft would be able to ambush small cruisers, which seemed to forget that the submarine was also equipped with 6 torpedo tubes up front, which would be far, far better weapons when dealing with any significant-sized surface combatant, especially as she was also fitted out with a recently developed ASDIC, what we now call sonar, which was an unusual thing to find even in many World War II-era submarines, let alone a sub that was being built in the early 1920s. In exercises, after some initial practice, the time from the order to surface the sub from periscope depth to opening fire was whittled down to just 1 minute 30 seconds, most of which was the time needed to get the sub actually above the water in the first place. And in gunnery trials, at the 1 minute 30 second mark, 5 out of the first 8 salvos, which were fired within 2 minutes, all straddled the target. Although there was some consideration for installing either a 3-inch or 40mm multiple pom-pom for an anti-aircraft battery, in the end it was decided not to fit them, partly to encourage diving as the best form of defence against aircraft, and partially because the areas that X1 was envisaged to operate in would not have much, if any, aircraft presence anyway, especially given the range limits of 1920s-era aircraft. However, a couple of Lewis machine guns were included in the sub just in case, and these could be brought up to the conning tower in the event of a real emergency, or more likely, it was thought, to cover a boarding party in the event of a prize being taken. In all this talk of guns, we haven't really covered the sub's torpedoes except in passing. These were seen as secondary weapons for use only against large surface warships, heavily escorted convoys, or the occasional very large merchant hull. As such, the 6 21-inch bow torpedo tubes were all that were installed, and these only carried the torpedoes that were in the tubes, plus one set of reloads, for a total of 12. One potential disaster was averted at the very last minute, in that the tubes were taken from a stockpile ordered for the L-class submarines. Now that wouldn't be a problem, except that the L-class were only supposed to be able to dive to around 200 feet, and the clips on the tube loading hatches were designed to handle about this pressure once the bow doors were open. But of course X1 might go down to more than twice that depth. Luckily, somebody noticed in time, and the clips in question were replaced by much stronger ones that could in theory survive the pressure of inrushing water even if the torpedo tube doors were opened while the sub was at maximum depth. X1 was laid down in November 1921, launched in June 1923, and commissioned at the end of 1925. After a few years of good service, engine issues aside, thoughts turned to a potential X2. The main changes suggested were, unsurprisingly, a better and more reliable set of diesels, especially the generator set, as even if the main set were downrated permanently to become somewhat reliable, if the 1200 brake horsepower units could actually be made to work as advertised, then X2 would be comfortably able to hit 22 knots, and higher speeds were possible if better main engines could also be delivered. An additional 5.2-inch turret was seen as desirable, and most of the rest of the comments were in regard to a variety of minor changes and certain watertight seals and better internal communication systems, which were both issues that had been identified and mostly fixed during X1's first years of service, but in X2 it was thought, well, these fixes should be built in from the start. As she entered service, X1 was just over 363 foot long, displacing just over 2,400 tons standard on the surface and just under 2,800 tons when she was fully loaded on the surface, and no less than 3,600 tons when she was submerged. Her submarine-mounted ASDIC set, one of only two in the world at the time, turned out to have additional benefits on top of just being able to detect surface ships. It could also be used to find enemy submarines lurking below the surface, thus, in theory, allowing the giant sub to either evade them, possibly engage them under the surface with torpedoes. It also meant that she was capable of travelling near the seabed where the sea was less than 500 foot in depth, while using the system to detect changes in seabed profile such as ridges, rocks or wrecks, and thus allow her to avoid them. With a little bit of experimentation, it was also found to be able to be used as a communication device, if somewhat crudely. A much better underwater communication system known as Fessenden gear was also installed, and this allowed underwater Morse code transmission between submarines at ranges in excess of 30 miles. Thanks to her immense size, she actually had 2 decks for most of her length, as well as extensive galley spaces, a cold store for frozen fresh meat, and other luxuries unheard of aboard most submarines of the period. There was even limited bathing facilities, as well as showers. The Royal Navy would not in fact operate a larger submarine until the Resolution-class ballistic missile submarines of the Cold War. However, even as she underwent her first active trials, the chances of successor submarines were slipping away fast. Although under the Washington Naval Treaty she didn't break any regulations, there was an overall maximum submarine tonnage, and of course a large cruiser-type submarine like herself took up the displacement of anywhere between 2 and 4 smaller submarines, and this alone would almost certainly ensure no repeats in the immediate future, as the Royal Navy wanted a fairly large subfleet. Her initial voyages also weren't too promising, the aforementioned engine issues dogging her badly. A dichotomy as, while underwater and testing her guns, the sub was one of, if not the best performers in the fleet. But any time the main diesels were spun up to full speed, something inevitably seemed to break fairly quickly. Eventually it was found that although a top speed of around 380 revolutions per minute was on paper possible using the main engines, In practice, anything much above 290 RPM tended to break or overheat something, except on mysterious odd occasions where nothing seemed to go wrong for indiscernible reasons. Once these initial issues were mostly out of the way, it was decided to base the submarine at Malta. Although she was designed for a Pacific war against Japan, in the early 1920s, none of the repair facilities east of Aden could accommodate a vessel of X1's size and complexity, whereas Malta's dockyards could keep the temperamental diesels working while also allowing the sub to be in a position to act against most potential adversaries, either directly from Malta or after a short voyage to a more appropriate port. Although it was also appreciated that the shallow, clear waters of the Mediterranean were not the ideal environment for so large a sub. She often attracted remarks when she was berthed up alongside the tender HMS Cyclops, for not only was X1 almost as long as the Cyclops, she made every other submarine alongside her, even the otherwise considerably large K-26, look like minnows. While operating in the Mediterranean, she conducted many practice attacks with torpedoes, guns, and torpedoes and guns against the ships of the Mediterranean fleet, in addition to a series of shore bombardment exercises. Her operational tempo was actually higher than some submarines would even see during World War II, and this, combined with the ever-finicky engines, meant that her running costs were high, as something almost always needed to be fixed when she showed back up in port. Although at the same time almost all the fixes were done fairly rapidly. The one saving grace of the main engines was that they were very quick and easy to take apart and put back together. But by the end of the 1920s, these ongoing costs saw her flotilla commander recommend that she be sent into reserve, as, if nothing else, this would at least salvage the catastrophically high Mediterranean fleet maintenance budget for submarines. It was also suggested that if this were done alongside a press release that she was actually being taken out of service as an operational failure, this might discourage other nations from pursuing cruiser submarines of their own. Although rather predictably, in the event, no one seems to have paid the slightest bit of attention to this attempt to manipulate world naval ship design via press release. She arrived back in the UK in 1930, and there was now a singular opportunity to turn the submarine's fortunes around. Replacing the riveted fuel tanks with newfangled welded ones would save weight and would prevent the gradual fuel leaks that had proved to occur with riveted fuel tanks at great depths, while at the same time there were supercharged 5,000 brake horsepower diesels for the Thames-class mine-laying subs just finishing development. In theory, one good overhaul could have replaced the troublesome main engines, and, with 1,250 or 1,600 brake horsepower generators derived from the main power plants of smaller new subs replacing the old German diesels, it would have pushed X1 well past her original design speed and left the Royal Navy in possession of one of the most capable long-range submarines on the planet, and it would have had a reliable power plant. But unfortunately, dockyard workers misjudged her weight when propping her in Portsmouth's No. 15 dry dock, and as the water was drained, she fell over on her side. Her strong hull meant that outside of some spilled battery acid, there was actually precious little damage except to the outer hull casing, which could be easily fixed. But the embarrassment of the incident appears to have driven the Admiralty to decide that no, she definitely was going into reserve. Here she would linger until the end of 1936, when she was quietly and without ceremony taken away for scrapping. Of course, as mentioned, this did not in any way, shape or form persuade other nations not to build their own cruiser submarines. The US would of course build subs like the Narwhal, Argonaut and Nautilus, the French would build Surcouf, and the Japanese would build a laundry list of large subs which culminated in the I-400s. And even the Germans would eventually get back in on the act, planning the Type 11 U-Kreuzer in World War II, although in the end they wouldn't actually build any themselves. One is of course left to wonder what would have happened if the sub had been refitted as described in the early 1930s. With a new power plant solving almost all outstanding issues, she would still not likely have seen many, if any, successors, as the 1930s London Naval Treaty would have limited that to a maximum of 2 derivative submarines, but whether she would have half-sisters or not, it's not that difficult to imagine the utter havoc X1 could have wreaked in the opening months of the Pacific campaign against Japanese invasion shipping and their woefully inadequate anti-submarine escorts. Or perhaps she could have been based with Force K at Malta, rising from the depths at night to savage Axis supply convoys to North Africa before slipping away again to spend a day on the seabed. But of course, that's something which we'll never know.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.